We're going to get started now with our panel discussion. Thanks for your attention. I appreciate it. And as you heard from earlier, we've got anthropologist, futurist, Professor Genevieve Bell to my right. This is Peter Adamak I'd like to introduce, the CEO of the Canberra Innovation Network. Craig Latham, the Deputy at the Australian Small Business and Family Enterprise Ombudsman, and Stephanie Roos, co-CEO of Beam Australia, co-founder, along with Victoria. Now, we're going to look at this theme, as we mentioned at the start of the symposium, the future of business, dynamic, digital, and socially responsible. I want to start with Geraldine, because you, as I said in your introduction, have...
Wait, Geraldine or Genevieve?
Well, sorry, Genevieve, my apologies. It's late for me. I woke up at 4 a.m, I do breakfast television, so my brain, I've got to sharpen it up. Genevieve, my apologies. You've been at the epicentre of the Silicon Valley, of the digital revolution, basically for 2 decades. Talk to me about the issue of social responsibility and how has that emerged? Because I know Google has an ethicist, various tech giants have started to look at ethical questions. Can you give our audience tonight a sense of how that's being dealt with on at the epicentre in Silicon Valley?
Yeah, absolutely. So listen, I think there's a couple of things you kind of have to tease apart. There's been a lot of conversations about artificial intelligence and ethics, and one of the challenges there is, of course, ethics are cultural, they're contextual, they're contingent. What we regarded as unethical 20 years ago, we may feel differently about now, and what we thought was appropriate, we know isn't anymore. So one of the hard problems that most technology companies face is that the notion that you could wire ethics into the machine, build it into the software, is almost an impossible notion, right? What you can do instead is say, what would it take to build ethical companies and to create a culture where it's okay to ask hard questions, and what would it mean to build into all of your developer culture an ability to think through the consequences of the work you're doing. So I think, what we've started to see is people saying, how do we make sure that we're surfacing the challenges? How do we ask the right questions? How do we have people whose job it is to think about those things inside companies? So you're absolutely right. There are ethicists, there are ethics panels, there's a lot of that kind of stuff. But I think one of the things, that's really been striking to me in maybe the last 3 or 4 years in my time in Silicon Valley is this notion that we may need to think differently about our education system. So it's not just a matter of, do you need to change things inside those companies? It's how do you think about the people that are coming to those companies and what it is that they're being taught in universities and then even all the way back through into kind of, primary school and high school. And one of the things most of the senior leaders I know reflect on is that whilst they have a collection of a workforce who are really quite competent technically, they tend to lack a certain set of core skills. So they're not good at communicating, they're not good at teamwork, they don't know how to collaborate with people who aren't just like them, they're not good at critical thinking, and they're not actually good in terms of engagement. And my colleagues who run HR in big tech companies say to me, it's basically like we get them and we need to teach them how to be human beings. So they say, we need to teach them these core skills, and they laugh. They say, we used to call them soft skills, but it turns out they're actually quite difficult. So we need to teach them core skills. And so I'm really struck by the fact that you can ask tech companies to think about ethics, but I actually think there's a broader call we need to be making about what it is that we are teaching all the way through our sector, and then what are the behaviours we're rewarding. So how do we think differently about what good leaders look like, about what we expect from our leadership cohort is actually about how you drive these things. So how do you have leaders that are willing not to do things just for a profit line? And what does it say about a company if your senior leadership team are breaking the rules knowingly? So it's not just about, what's the technology, but what's the culture, what do you tolerate, what's the culture and the tone that's set from the board and the company down.
And Craig Latham, as the Family Enterprise Ombudsman and someone who looks at regulatory reform, how do you see that happening in this modern economy, as Genevieve mentioned, in terms of the next generation of technology? We don't know where it's going to be, but in terms of regulation, how do you see all of that unfolding?
Yeah, regulation's an interesting area, right? So it's sort of our view of our office is wherever possible we need regulators to be out of the way. So you really, for a small business, compliance costs are really, really important. So the person who serves on the counter during the day is the same person who has to go home at night and sit at the table and do the accounts, the tax and all the other regulatory requirements. So really, really important to minimise that impact on, and we're always thinking about small business, but business more generally as well. So what should regulation look like? Small. Understandable is always nice. Some of the things we're seeing of late, one of the ones that worries me at the moment, and this may gazump a later question, but one of the bits of regulation that's worrying me the most at the moment is one called single touch payroll, which people will know in this room, I presume. In single touch payroll, it's been introduced for large companies. And so for the moment, it's going, well, it's about to be there for large companies. It's built into the software, or is going to be built, or is already built into many of the packages. And so for a company using one of these large packages, it's just something that happens in the background. It just is something that you've fed the data into the system, and the system's nice and smart, and it feeds it off, and the tax office is happy, and everyone's good. For small business, that's okay for those small businesses that use a software package that is up to date, and they're using the part of the software package for wages. So many businesses will not be using software at all, will be using software that's out of date, using software that's not connected to the internet or whatever else. They'll be using a piece of paper or an Excel spreadsheet, right? When that comes in a year's time for those small businesses, that's going to be potentially crippling if there's not a solution put out there for it. And that solution needs to be one that's very simple, easy for any business to use, easy to use, even if you have one employee for 2 months a year, because you're going to be inside the system and you're not going to want to get MyOb or something in the whole cloud computing package. So the challenge that our office is putting out there for government, this time the ATO and Treasury, is to how to construct systems that work with business, not against them. So it's, again, this is a sensible, intuitive, something that works in there without putting businesses to a great deal of work.
And Stephanie, from your perspective as an entrepreneur and with Beam Australia, you talk about smart time work. Yesterday we saw a massive loss of jobs at Telco, Telstra, 8,000 jobs gone. Yeah. Do you see your role as, I guess, trying to help major companies like that and smaller companies, but instead of just getting rid of people, look to be more flexible?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you heard Vic touch on this earlier as well, but traditionally we've thought about human resources in increments of FTE. So, you know, as Vic said, that sort of starts with budget planning. Okay, here's the amount of heads you have, and therefore, you know, you go off and do it. And so it's 0 or 100% of an FTE, and that's just, it's efficient, the systems are there, the infrastructure's there to support that. But if you can think about, well, for instance, automation is going to reduce some people's jobs, but not 100%. So to think about the jobs that are being made redundant by automation in terms of X number of, or X thousand FTEs seems a little short-sighted, maybe, in terms of the human capital that you're just losing from the organisation. And so if we start to think in more fractional work terms, we can think about, okay, of those roles that are going to be, that are there, and we're still going to need that kind of function. Some of it's going to be automated, but maybe 40%, maybe 20%, maybe 80%. How do we give people options to stay in the workforce and to maybe work in a way that gives them a little bit more balance? Like 94% of Australians, they probably actually want to be working flexibly, and start to think about, okay, how do we reduce people's jobs but still give people an opportunity to participate in the workforce, as opposed to thinking about things in the FTE increment.
Yep. Peter Adamek, CEO of the Canberra Innovation Network, you've dealt with startups your whole career. I'm interested, you know, from a personal perspective, last week I had a week in Queensland, and I had a digital detox. I went off Twitter and Facebook, and it was so liberating. It was wonderful. I was wondering, with your startups, do you find any? How do you see the evolution of the technology and the technologies that you've been dealing with through this fast, connected, smart phase? Do you get a sense now that people are wanting a bit more space to breathe?
One of the exciting things about being on this panel is that you have no idea what Kieran's going to ask you. I feel privileged to be here with all of you. I feel like we have those people that Genevieve described, like they don't know a lot of things when they enter the community, and the community sort of looks after them and teaches them how to communicate, how to behave, how to be respectful, because you have to. There's the Startup Hub is sort of interesting place. We have 45 companies on one floor, and they meet every day and bump into each other. A lot of them are tech companies, but a lot of them are not, which is quite interesting. I mean, every company today needs to be a tech company. We don't have an ethicist, definitely. We can't afford that yet. But we see a lot of people trying to solve real human problems. I just talked to a founder today who is trying to help people to be pain-free if they suffer from chronic pain. And she is a person who suffered chronic pain, and she invented a way how to help herself. She's now trying to use technology to make it available to everyone on the planet. We have people who try to use augmented reality to help kids with ADHD and other developmental problems. We have old ladies who are startup founders, which I find really interesting, and they are trying to help people who are suffering vicarious trauma. Again, using technology to do check-ins. There would be people in police force, in fire forces, and so on. So there's a variety of people working on startup ideas that are aiming to change the world. Not all of them are tech, pure tech. We have some pure tech, but a lot of them are looking after people. And I think the next revolution of tech is going to be the human-facing revolution. We have Industry 4.0. This is a term coined by people who look at how robots talk to robots and how sensors talk to other robots. And seemingly we don't need people, but we actually all need to look after people. And I think the next wave of change is about how do we look after people.
Yeah, and Genevieve, you touched on this in your lectures last year, and it resonated with me because I guess with business, you can have customers that are fully tech savvy and will be across every new development you might undertake, and then you've got those who want the old way, who aren't as savvy when it comes to digital technologies, any changes. It's the inequity, I guess, in terms of the digital and the new economy. Can you talk to the audience about your view when it comes to trying to ensure that everyone has access to the benefits of a new economy?
Well, I mean, Craig was reflecting on some of it just then, right? One of the challenges is that as we move to new technical formats, as we require engagement with technology, not everyone starts in the same place. For any number of reasons. It may be you're not starting in the same place because you live somewhere that has poor connectivity. I think in Australia that might be the reverse. If you live somewhere that has good connectivity, you're really special and the rest of us aren't. Say, coming home from America to ADSL has been an interesting transition in my life. But there's a bit that says we know that there are lots of ways of thinking about how inequity happens, right? Part of it's about what's the infrastructure that's available. Part of it's about your ability to pay for that infrastructure. Part of it's about your ability to make sense of it and use it. Part of it is we often assume that if a household is connected, everyone knows how to use it the same way. We certainly assume that most people use technology as much as the heaviest adopters in any society do. And the reality is that's not true either. And if we're not really careful, one of the things that we know has happened in Australia and elsewhere is that as each new technological infrastructure unfolds, it reproduces all the same inequalities. When, Victoria talked about the 40-hour work week, and we know that, for women and men, they experience that completely differently, right? The 40-hour work week and labour-saving devices didn't necessarily mean we did less work. It often meant we did more. And so there's sort of piece that says, how do you think about the rollout of technology so you don't stabilise or make permanent certain kinds of inequities, whether it's about gender, race in Australia, regional versus urban, whether it's about Indigenous versus settler populations. And then we have all these new technologies that are coming that promise to stabilise or fix some of those things, but just re-entrench them again. So part of it becomes How do you not have the problem Craig was describing, where you have a regulatory framework that requires everyone have access, where that access has a masked cost lurking in it somewhere, by an entire software system you're never going to use, or assumes that everyone's running the most recent generation of things. And so often the challenge is that the assumptions about access are lurking really deep.
Yeah.
And we have to do a much better job of kind of thinking about what are the other consequences of saying this is the standard or this is the operating
And
assumption.
much of that, Genevieve, would come down to who's writing the algorithm, wouldn't it? And the technology.
Absolutely. It comes out, well, not only who's writing the kind of the software packages or the algorithms, but what are the worldviews that are lurking inside of them. The example I sometimes give about algorithms, right? So if all an algorithm is a piece of software that automates a process. So it just says, if A plus B, then C. Well, it's just a theory, right? If you've ever used a washing machine, you've used an algorithm. So when you go to, and I'm assuming you've all used a washing machine. Apparently not my colleague here in the blue shirt in the second seat, but the rest of you. So if you go to a washing machine and you pick the wool cycle or the delicate cycle, the washing machine says cold water, low spin, 1 rinse, less agitation, because someone decided that's how it is best to wash delicate fabrics. That's basically an algorithm.
Yeah.
What happened with the most recent generation of computing technology is we used data to make those algorithms happen, right? So we basically said, if this happens, it will trigger another series of actions. It's just an automation of acts, right? One of the challenges with that is there's 2 ways that new algorithms get written. Either they get written by human beings, who are like the washing machine, deciding if delicate, then cold, 1 rinse, no agitation. And the problem there is that sometimes the assumptions that get written in are really hard to see. So in a washing machine, we know when it doesn't work. With an algorithm, it's a little more complicated. There was America. You just have to preface this story by, it was in America. And there was a bloke who built a dating website in the very early days, and it used psychodemographics to do matching. So it used attributes, characteristics to determine who would date who. But the guy who built it also firmly believed that all human beings, well, in this case, all men wanted women who were much shorter than them. And so in addition to pattern matching by features, it matched men only with women shorter than them by a very particular amount. And again, because America, someone sued. Love Americans. And the guy who sued basically went, why don't I ever get tall women? I really like tall women. I want women who are taller than me. Where are my tall women? And it got to a deposition, never to court. And in it, he was asked why the system wouldn't match tall women with shorter men. And this guy just looked at the lawyer and went, I don't understand what you're talking about. Men don't like tall women. And the lawyer says, well, that's not what my client thinks. And he's like, what's wrong with your client? It sort of became clear in this moment that the man who built the program in his heart believed that his desire was all human desire.
Yeah.
And because he'd never said it out loud, because why would you? Because it's truth. No one had ever said to him, oi, sunshine, what the hell is your problem? No. And so he'd built an algorithm that had a worldview in it that he didn't know how to unpack, right?
Yeah.
And so one of the challenges with algorithms is that frequently lurking inside of them are ideas that we don't know how to challenge because no one's ever said them out loud. Or when they have, they've said them out loud to people who are just like them, who didn't go, no. So there's this sort of interesting challenge, right, where some of the algorithms, and I know it sounds like a bad example, but now imagine that example has to do with your healthcare or your ability to cross a border or your ability to get a loan or your ability to be scrutinised by a tax officer or a policeman. And then imagine what the assumptions might be, right? And think about how we don't know how to talk about them. And the solution was often to say, well, we'll just let the data do the algorithm building rather than the humans. So we'll use data because the data's not biased like people are, right? But the reality is every data set you use was collected by someone with some kind of intent. And it's incomplete and partial, and it's always historic. The data always came from before, not from now. And so the thing about if you use data to model algorithms, you're modelling it on the way the world has been. And in some cases that's okay, but in lots of cases, and I'm looking around this room, it's about half female, would you want a pay parity tool built using all of our pay now? Exactly. Because it turns out for the women in the room, not so good for us. So if you wanted to build a pay parity tool that got to full pay parity, you couldn't use the data that we already have. You'd actually have to use it as a diagnosis, not as the actual data itself. And so one of the challenges is we think about algorithms, if we aren't really careful about how we utilise them and how we scrutinise them, lurking inside of them are ideas about the way the world could or should be that aren't necessarily the worlds we want to build. And because I'm going to just keep going with this answer, there's a second problem here for Australia, which is we keep buying algorithms from other places.
Yeah.
And so now lurking inside those algorithms are whole other worldviews that aren't our own. So what would it mean to buy a sentencing guideline tool from America with ideas about race built into it, or an identikit technology for doing facial recognition from the police built in a different country? What does it mean to buy a strategy augmented software from somewhere whose strategic frameworks we don't agree with, but we don't know how to ask those questions, right? We don't know how to write them into tender contracts. We don't know how to think about all of that. So, yeah, messy.
Yeah, well, it's challenging. It sure is.
Sorry.
No, it was a great answer, Craig Latham. I'm interested in your thoughts on this.
Can I come back
Yeah, for sure.
on just
Pick
that
up.
one? Because the interesting thing is we're not just talking about algorithms here either. That this is actually, when I look at the law, this is actually built into the law as well. That the law is built on precedent and it looks back in what's happened in the past and how we want to legislate for the future. It's when you look at something like, say, in the tax law around concept of permanent establishment, it's built around a certain view of the world. This is the way business is run. When you have something like e-commerce comes along and you have the loss of relevance of place and stuff, it changes it all. And I know when that actually happened, we spent, I think it was about 10 years of furious writing before everyone said, no, it sort of works still. But we had to actually convert from this thing that assumes certain facts about the world, convert that into this new setting. Right.
And then imagine, because Craig and I were talking about this earlier, imagine the consequence for that if what you have done is trained a set of algorithms on historic data. It will by its nature be quite conservative, right? It will interpret based on all the interpretations that it's seen before, which means it's really hard to think about how you encounter novel situations. For Australians, imagine you'd train something on precedent, you'd never get to Mabo. I mean, there's a whole lot of law we really care about that you would never be able to make because it would just constantly reinforce the history up until now.
Unless your algorithm says come up with something that's wrong.
Yeah.
Then you could come up with
Possibly with Mabo,
something that you haven't thought about.
You train it with QCs, you know, silks. But you know how then what becomes critical, right, is the piece that Craig is saying, which is who's training the system, like whose worldview are you building, and how do you make sure that conversation is being had, right? So how do you not? I mean, to Vic and Steph's point, how do you not train a machine to think 40 hours is the right way and 40 hours equals a full-time human being? Because that's already a worldview.
And is that part of the, your view now at the ANU is to try and say, well, we've got the quarantine service for stopping pests coming into the country. When it comes to algorithms or bad apps or whatever, we should be also testing algorithms and software and technology before it's used in this country.
Absolutely. Yeah. The same way the same way we have always asked questions about the things that came across our borders. I'm not sure I feel good about all of the ways we do that, but we have often asked about what it meant to bring biomedical technologies into Australia, medicines into Australia. We've asked questions about what were they tested on, what do they do, what are the tests they've passed, and imagining that we're about to buy algorithmic tools that are going to sit inside critical functions inside Australia, whether it's the military, medicine, financial services. You know, it's one thing to imagine the Banking Royal Commission of 2018. Imagine the Banking Royal Commission of 2030, because there will be one. And you have a bunch of CEOs having to stand there and go, we don't know what happened, the algorithm told us to. Well, where'd you get it from, America? It's not going to look like a good answer.
No. And Steph, when it comes to the workforce, the Chartered Accountants Survey of businesses found that 40 to 60% of jobs via automation, economic, social factors are going to see changes to an estimated 40 to 60% of jobs in coming years. It's a huge amount, isn't it? Mm-hmm. That sort of disruption in the workforce. Is that your sense of things at the moment? And with is there an appetite from the private sector to be flexible? Because quite clearly they have to be.
Yeah, we agree, they have to be. And there's an increasing appetite. And it's actually really interesting in getting to have so many conversations with organisations from not-for-profits, startups, high-growth, young, small companies and SMEs to corporates, really established corporates, and government as well, to see there's a real spectrum. And there's a spectrum from, everything from still the presenteeism, sort of what I can see getting done is actually what's getting done, and that's the value to my organisation, to the very, other end of the spectrum, which is just we will find the best talent wherever it is and take that with whatever availability they have, and we'll just measure our success on output and on outcomes. But as there's a lot of talk about 40 to 60% of the current jobs being replaced by automation and robots. Well, as there's been a lot of comment on just here in this panel, humans are needed in order to generate any kind of machine learning or AI, and it won't be the case that robots come in and then humans just don't have any place and off they can go, off home. So we just need to make sure that with the capabilities we have within our workforce, and to take the country forward and to take each business forward as well, that they have those skills that are going to be complementary to the automation, or to the robots, for instance, so the critical thinking and creativity, for instance, and the judgment and the ability to ask good questions, and to sort of dissect things in a very human way. So we just need to think about how do we reskill some of our humans. How do we balance out work a little bit to be planning what work needs to get done in a different way. And so companies can still think about optimising productivity and minimising their on-balance sheet human capital costs as well, but just to be thinking about it in a different way that still retains the knowledge that we have in the country.
Not so rigid. And
Yeah.
Peter, what's your, as I said, you've got 20 years of international experience helping startups, companies innovate and grow. Some succeed, some don't. What's your experience on those, if you had a common denominator for those that do well, what is it?
I think I will come back to what Genevieve mentioned, and it's the simple communication skill. It's the ability to ask the right questions and look for the answer from the right viewpoint, which is often the user or customer viewpoint. And a lot of the founders are passionate about their viewpoint, and they kind of run at full steam, and that's when you end up with dating websites that reflect the founders' principles and values. So I reflecting back on what you were saying, Genevieve, what we do a lot in our startup center and in our innovation programs is basically teach people these basic skills. How do you make sure you are solving a problem someone cares about, rather than do you just find someone onto whom you can force your solution? And a lot of people find this transition from looking for a problem to my solution to the situation where I really care about a person who will be using it, and I don't care about the solution at the moment so much. I think this is a transforming and really important moment in innovation, and a lot of our work is about that transition. So basic communication skill is at the core of the future success of all innovations, in my opinion.
And one of the things that is emerging, I know certainly from my perspective, when I see the questions around data usage, and we have so much of our data out there, it becomes a question of privacy. And I know you in your live lecture last year started with a clip of, I think it was Zelman Cohen.
Yes, Zelman Cohen.
Sir Zelman Cohen, a former Governor General, and his concerns were almost. This was from the 1960s.
From 1969.
And it sounded like you could have said it today.
Oh, yeah. So Sir Zelman Cohen, Governor-General of Australia, was the Vice-Chancellor at Queensland University, UQ, when, in the middle of the Vietnam War, when there was a debate about would you let police onto campus to arrest students, and he thought that the university should protect student rights. And he'd come to start thinking about what did it mean to move from a world where everything that was known about you was in a manila folder, where one person could find it, to everything about you being on a computer where lots of people could find it, where data could basically talk to each other. And he said that he thought that the notion of privacy was the last kind of bastion, the last thing that humans would have and the thing we should most fight to defend. 1969. He's very clear about this, right? Of course, what's different since 1969, and which was, I think, even probably up for debate then, is what we consider to be private and why. And the things that we would now say in public that we wouldn't have said in 1969 is a varied and long list. And the consequences for those speech acts are very different. But, it's nearly a decade since Mark Zuckerberg, the CEO of Facebook, declared that the privacy genie was out of the bottle and that privacy was dead. And it turns out he was wrong. I mean, quite spectacularly wrong. Even he'll say that now. And there's an argument that, in fact, the privacy genie's gone back into the bottle and is dragging the cork behind her and is hoping someone will duct tape it shut. And it turns out that set of concerns run in really interesting places demographically. So we actually see in the US, I don't know the Australian data so well, but the US and Western Europe, it's actually millennials who have a profound care about privacy. They enact it differently than we do, or than my generation does. But they care about privacy. They're choosing certain kinds of communication channels that they can restrict access. They're choosing what they do and don't share. Most millennials went off Facebook at the point that their parents and grandparents turned up on Facebook because, frankly, why would you stay somewhere where your parents and grandparents were if you didn't have to? So there was a full wholesale kind of movement sideways. But I think one of the interesting challenges is about both what we consider to be private, for whom and under what circumstances. The fact that it is never as simple as private or public. But I also think increasingly one of the things that Sir Zolman Cohen understood but didn't yet have the language for back in '69 was that for lots of human beings, it's not the privacy that is so much the concern, right? We imagine that all kinds of entities know things about us. The bank, the tax office, the place where our kids are enrolled, our doctor. They know how old we are and our gender and a bunch of other things about us. We worry when that information is leaked inappropriately, as we should, right? But what we also now have this much more interesting and, I think, visceral reaction to is not just the individual pieces of data, but the judgment that sits on top of them.
Yeah.
So, it's one thing for them to know how old you are. It's another thing to know how old you are, what music you listen to, and threaten to tell your peers about it. I don't know how I'd feel at the university if people knew that I occasionally listen to Justin Bieber. It would be embarrassing. And I do, and it would be. I know that. And part of it becomes what is the judgment that sits on top of that, right? So you'll sometimes have that moment, I think, as a human being where it feels faintly creepy that a system knows so much about you, and we know those kind of violations when they happen, right? The one that was the one that sort of triggered that thinking for me. I was in the US, I went to my ATM, stuck my bank card in, and the ATM wished me a happy birthday. Yeah. And I remember thinking, I know you know my bank, because, got all my details, so happy birthday, weird, but I could live with that. 6 months later, I go back to the same ATM, stick my bank card in, and it wishes me a happy anniversary. And I thought, well, I'm single, so, what the hell? And I'm like, oh, God, you mean my anniversary with you, the bank? I was like, that's just weird. Yeah. And I remember thinking, you've layered some judgment on top of that just feels odd and unreasonable. And most of you will have encountered companies attempting to fix that, right? So how many people in the room use Netflix regularly?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, okay. So I don't know how long you've been using Netflix, but over the last year or so, you will have noticed that sometimes it surfaces content for you and then says at the bottom, because you watched ...
Yeah.
It didn't used to say that. And one of the things that Netflix found about its customers was that people were like, why do you think I want to watch that content? What are you saying about me that I want? What? Why?
Yeah.
And we felt like our TV was judging us.
Yeah.
And that it knew things, and it had opinions. And so part of what they did was actually introduce a feature where the machine explains its judgment to you so that it feels less like a judgment and more just like an obvious consequence. And I think privacy is one thing that we need to protect. The second order of the consequence of that, though, is what happens when that data gets remobilised, reimagined and used to assess us, and we don't always know why.
Yeah, and I guess it goes to the business world too, Craig, in terms of the laws, because it's about, well, I know in Europe, individuals own their own data. And so what about the legal questions here, not just for individuals, but for companies? I mean, they're profound implications, aren't they?
And I'll come to this as well, but I'm interested in this whole idea of why data matters, and it's not, I think, just the consequences of it, but it's the richness of it and the interconnectivity of it, so that it's not, the judgment's not being made in an unfounded, potentially, way, but in a very deep way that you don't even know how much this thing knows. But for just normal privacy for business, so it's not something we come across a lot, but we did have an example recently where it was I think it was a doctor who's used a certain service, and that service was using that data and selling on the data to others, and it was always out of date. And it was reflecting because it actually mattered because people were making judgments on the back of this. We're still trying to unravel that one, and it's really hard because I bet you when as we dig deeper, we'll find that somewhere in the fine print that person has signed away the rights to that data, and there's a real question, a legal question as to when you don't see the clause because you just click it, whether it is that properly disclosed to you? Did you properly make informed consent about it? So it does come up, but it probably matters. I'm just trying to think in business sense, because most a business's main idea is get out there and push yourself out there. The sorts of things where privacy can matter are things around intellectual property, and what that means actually in this world as well.
So does it? I mean, so that same rule in the EU that said that consumers own data, the most recent refresh of that from the end of last month, one of the things it put onto European businesses was the notion that citizens had the right to what's called explanation. So you can go to a company and say, why have you denied me this service, right? So, or why has your algorithm given me this outcome? So, I mean, it's the kind of an interesting way of thinking about the reverse of that, right? It isn't about data privacy, but data use, where your customers and citizens can basically come to you and ask you to justify your business decisions.
And we're starting to talk about the future train here as well. So
that future train. There's a question I want to ask Genevieve about in relation to that in a moment. But I'm interested in, Stephanie, you know, I touched on that thing about the apps and getting rid of it and just having a bit of time. I guess it's a time-poor existence when you've got young kids and all that sort of stuff. Yeah. Can you give a sense of how that sort of broader issue played a part in you and Victoria in your journey to build this business that you've got in terms of wanting flexibility and maximising your time?
Yeah. Absolutely. And so Beam was born out of a really personal experience from both. Vic and I have been friends since the dance floors of university down in Melbourne. But, you know, we were both really driven, still are, I'd say, hopefully, in our careers, and but more in the traditional, you know, corporate path. And, you know, work as hard as we can. You sort of want to break through any of these kind of barriers to, I think often, you know, as women in our generation, we actively seek out careers that are traditionally difficult for women. I don't know why, make the path a little bit harder. But, you know, what are these glass ceilings? What are you talking about, Mum? There is no, you know, difference. There is no... and, you know, if I can talk about my own experience, is that, you know, I was loving my career and work and everything, and when I was running the Corporate Executive Board, CEB, for Australia and New Zealand, and, you know, then I had our first baby, and it hit me like a bit of a slap in the face, like, oh, what is this, and who am I, and what does this mean? But then sort of, you know, one kid, I think, okay, go back to work, pretend that's not happening, because at work you can't talk about it, and... You know, does that mean you're less serious about your career if you say, oh my God, I didn't get any sleep last night, it makes you a bad employee, etc. But then 2 kids comes along, and then that makes it really difficult to pretend you don't have a family, or that you can't come to the 7 a.m, you know, meeting, or the, you know, 8 p.m. dial-in for 2 hours or whatever. And so, yeah, really, for me, it just ran me completely into the ground. And I think it's safe to say, from the volume of talent we hear from, that many people are feeling in this same situation, which is that they're trapped in a full-time role, that they are either they've experienced burnout, they're facing health consequences already, like I did, or that, you know, and that they're having to make that binary decision of all in or all out. And so for Victoria and I, we could both see that not only were we forced, essentially, to step out of the workforce because we couldn't maintain that sort of 80-hour work week, but that it was happening all around us. And so, again, we're just talking about one segment of people who can't, you know, work in that environment. There's lots. Yeah, the fallout of people, and that there's nowhere for them to go either, because often people are afforded to, you know, more flexibility in their job, but it's after they come back from mat leave, right? So we're seeing a little bit more flexibility for men now and other people, but you kind of earn the right to work in a different format than the traditional 40-hour work week, where what we're saying is actually there are huge talent pools out there, and if you're just a little bit flexible and you think about what people are actually wanting, you can, get incredible talent in return for that flexibility. So I think I've gone a bit off track. Did
No,
I
it was
answer your
interesting
question?
because
Sorry.
I guess the thing is, the question goes to the millennials that Victoria spoke about as well. Do you get the feeling, Peter, because you, as I said, with your startups and the companies you work with, are they more flexible with the workforce, with not just women but men? Are the hours more flexible?
It's incredibly hard to be a startup founder. Typically, you are driven, your fuel is the purpose, right? You want to change the world, that's driving you, and it's creating an enormous demand on you. It's the best and the worst boss, because it tells you that you can't stop. You have to do it. So you drive yourself to the very edge, and people do that, and we see them every day. I've read somewhere that 50% of startup founders are 50% more likely to develop mental health illness than any other profession. And so it's really important for them to be in an environment where they are also not isolated or alone, because that can lead to tragic consequences, and they need to kind of tell each other to look after themselves. They need to be able to come for the comfort, come for the debrief when they had a terrible meeting with where the investors laughed at them, because sometimes they do. These are people who want to change the world. That means they want to do something that doesn't exist, that nobody seemingly asked for. And I have been inspired by the story of the first train. And I feel like I'm living this with our founders every single day. They are moving that thing, and it's not going fast enough yet, and everybody's laughing. And so for them it's really important to have the environment. Very very inspiring. I think I need to tap into your knowledge, Genevieve, because I saw the female founder I talked to today with the chronic pain app. She showed me, well, this is a data from my patient. She agreed to share this data. So, and I saw every day how she felt. I saw the halos and the zombie moments for that person as they experience pain. And I'm thinking we need to early talk to these founders, because they have these big moral dilemmas. We have a construction company that sees where every worker is on a construction site, right? So and it's a safety thing. They are driven by the purpose to make those places more safe, but they have also the responsibility how they look after the data. So I'm definitely going to ask you for a talk to our startup founders, and I'm going to tap into Beam as well, because one of the other issues that the startups have is they cannot attract the best talent. They cannot afford it. A lot of them are thinking in full-time roles, but what if they could tap into somebody's work on a part-time basis? So I'm definitely...
Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
We've got 15 minutes left, so if any questions from the floor, please get them ready. And I just want to ask Genevieve on that question that I touched on earlier, is in relation to that train coming down the track. And your 3A Institute talks about autonomy, agency and assurance. And I guess I want the assurance that we're not going to build a machine that's smarter than us, that'll basically supersede Homo sapiens.
I think we'll build machines that are smarter than some of us.
Yeah.
that may not be a bad thing. Listen, I think one of the interesting things about the whole kind of promise of artificial intelligence is when it was very first kind of being spelled out back. So there's an academic conference in 1956, a bunch of mathematicians, linguists, philosophers get together and sort of say, listen, the power of computing seems to be advancing exponentially. What are we going to do with all that power? And the metaphor for thinking about computers back in the 50s was that they were brains. And so someone says, well, we want to make it more like a human brain, right? What would that be? And so this group of people sit there in 56 and they identify 4 things they think that computers should be able to do. Should be able to understand natural language, so the way we speak generically. Should be able to handle abstractions and concepts. It should be able to do tasks that humans are normally reserved for humans. And it should be able to teach itself. And so they sort of said, we think that's what artificial intelligence would look like, right? Now, there are some interesting challenges in that technically. It's actually really hard to understand natural language. Everyone in this room has had a moment where someone has said something to them and you have not understood it, not because they had an accent, but because you had no context or it was just a weird thing. Yeah. Well, magnify that out, right? So actually getting machines to understand the way we talk to each other, quite tricky. The notion of handling abstractions is hard. The ideas of doing tasks that humans usually do, actually quite difficult because we have to be able to articulate them enough to automate them. And then the notion that a machine would learn actually requires all kinds of notions about training, right, that are actually quite kind of complicated. So that's all AI is, right? And these days that means it's about data and algorithms and learning techniques and sensing technologies and decision making. Those are the things that it is. There's a whole lot of things it isn't. It's not a robot coming to kill you. John Connor is still alive and well and living in a movie somewhere, and the Master and the Daleks, they still can't get upstairs. We'll all be fine. But the reality is we have this tremendous anxiety about that, and that anxiety has a couple of pieces of the history that are worth remembering, right? You all laugh because you're mostly in an age bracket that remember kill John Connor and I've seen things you people wouldn't believe and exterminate the Doctor. I mean, we all know the science fiction of what it told us, right, was that if machines could walk and talk and reason, the very first thing they would decide to do upon gaining those powers is kill us. Yeah. Inexplicably, that would be their first impulse. And of course, that comes from the Frankenstein story, which is, 200 years old this year. And that story made sense because it taps into a whole series of preceding stories about the Golem, the Sorcerer's Apprentice, Pinocchio, and ideas that come out of the Greco-Roman tradition about the work of gods and the work of humans. And so there's this kind of arc in the Western imagination that we are the highest thing on the pyramid. We're it, right? We're as good as it gets, and nothing else is. And of course, even in the arc of the Western tradition, not everyone got to be at the top of the pyramid, right? It's been less than 100 years that we imagined women might be as good as men. It's been less than 100 years that we imagined that Native people might be as good as white people, that African Americans might be as good as white people. I mean, that pyramid's had a very particular look to it about who was the most intelligent and who was going to be descented. And even Alan Turing, who is probably the most important computer scientist of the 20th century, he was at some of these early conversations and he wrote a note to his boss, and in it he basically said, listen, I don't think people are going to be too happy about this whole thinking machine thing. It's going to cause a lot of controversy. He says people are going to be really agitated about it because, it's doing the work of gods and all this other stuff. But he says the number one reason people are going to be really kind of cranky about this idea of machines thinking like people, he said the most upset people are going to be the people who think that they are the most intelligent because they will have the most to lose. Yeah. And I think if you look at the people who are most agitated by the notion that machines might be good at things, you can see that reflected. Now, of course, the reality is outside of the sort of West, there are other stories we tell about machinery that are completely different. If you grew up in Japan, you grew up with a completely different set of cultural stories about machinery. You grew up with the first robots that were built in the 1700s. The automata there are called karakuri. They are small, mechanical. They don't replicate human tasks. They were originally used to automate the tea ceremony. They were about machinery of grace and beauty. And you fast forward to the 20th century, and the stories that get wrapped around robotic objects in Japan are never about them killing you. Okay. In fact, most Japanese people will say the robots are our friends. And they're looking at Astro Boy, they're looking at a completely different history, right? And the fear is not that the robotic objects will kill you, it's that we won't have enough of them soon enough to do all these tasks. Completely different narrative, right? And when you ask the leading Japanese roboticist, the man in some ways most responsible for where Japan's preeminence is in this space, he always says, listen, the reason we imagine the robots will rise up and kill us or that we will somehow be eclipsed by technology is because we are projecting our worst fears about what humans have done to other humans onto the devices. And he says, here's the thought exercise. What would it be if you imagined that the technology would embody our best angels, not our worst? What would it be to imagine that the technology would be built with our best intentions, not our worst ones? Because he says, the worst things that have ever been done in the history of the world were done by humans to other humans. So if we build machines with those impulses, of course they will be scary, scary things. But what if it's the other way around? What if we built them to reflect our best selves? In which case, the notion of having machinery that could think differently than us, that might be glorious. The idea of a machine that could think its way out of some of the places we have gotten ourselves, God, what a wonderful promise that would be. The notion that a machine could possibly think through solutions to things that have been intractable, that sounds like a glorious promise, not something that you'd think, oh shit, it's smarter than us, we need to kill it. Which is, effectively what that becomes. It's a binary, right? Either it's smarter than us and we're doomed, or it isn't and we're doomed. So I'm like, I want to kind of imagine there's something else there.
But you're right, some big thinkers have thought that, like Musk and Hawking, and they've expressed that sort of sentiment, haven't they?
Yeah, and they're all wrong.
Any questions from the floor?
Shouldn't say that about them. They're
No,
nice
it's
people.
fine. Yep. Sir, yeah, if you could, there's a microphone just behind. If you could just introduce yourself, please.
I was really interested in the observation that the advent of the steam engine changed time. 6 months ago, Mark Zuckerberg appeared before a Senate committee. It's arguable that he breached the privacy of a goodly number of people in this room. As at close of business today, he's the third richest person in the world, and his net wealth has increased exponentially in the last 6 months. My question is this: does the reward and incentive mechanisms provided by a free market economy need to change to take account of an autonomously enabled society?
Genevieve?
Someone else was like, crap.
one's
Someone
too
else.
hard.
No, that was. Well, so listen, I actually think the most interesting thing in the last year wasn't Mark testifying, but what it revealed, which was that we have spent, I would say, 100 years where capitalism needed democracy. Democracy was capitalism's preferred vehicle. It spread it well, it regulated things in a way that made capitalism tick on nicely. Capitalism needed countries, companies were mostly attached to companies. What's interesting about where Facebook has landed in the last year, and I think Google too, and to a lesser extent some other companies, is that they no longer track national borders. And it's also clear that many of those companies now succeed in countries we would not describe as democratic. I think at the same time, our democracies and countries that would regard themselves as democratic are profoundly challenged. And part of the challenge is that we have conflated the ideas of consumers and citizens to be one thing. And in fact, citizens and consumers are two completely different things. You are a citizen of a country, you are a consumer of a product. They're not the same thing at all. And there's an argument, for me at least, that says unraveling those things might be quite powerful. Because what does it mean to say, well, actually, these companies that cross borders may require different jurisdictional thinking. We may actually need to imagine and regulate them differently. It's no surprise that, in some ways, the conversation in the US about Facebook for the last 6 months has been about, does it need to be broken apart as though it were a monopoly, because that's the last piece of law we have on the books. Of course, that monopoly law was written to manage the railways.
Yeah.
It is in fact a legacy of that moment in time, and it's the only way we know how to think about what it means to do all of that. So I think, the challenge is as much about how do we think about the relationship between capitalism and democracy? How do we think about the relationship between business and citizenship? And then what does it mean to imagine, because we haven't talked about it terribly much, that a whole lot of these technologies are also being built in other places with which we have far less to do and far less visibility. So we talk about Facebook and Google and Amazon. We don't talk about Baidu and Tencent in quite the same ways, but Baidu and Tencent, both Chinese companies, are probably investing more in the development of AI than those other companies are. They are certainly proceeding from a completely different set of data. They are proceeding with a completely different set of intents, and they are building out a world of technology that may or may not come here, but will certainly go to other places. And we don't scrutinise them with the same rigor or with the same desire to understand, right? So imagining that all of the AI in the world is being built in Silicon Valley is always a mistake because it's being built in London and Tel Aviv and a bunch of other places, but there are also whole worlds of algorithms and classes of activities that are going on in places that are not visible to us at all, where I can almost guarantee you the outcomes will be completely different.
Yeah. Peter, your thoughts?
I feel I need to share my story because I'm probably on the panel only person who grew up in non-democratic country. I was born in Czechoslovakia in 1973, so deep in normalization of our relationship with the Soviet Union. And privacy was really important for survival. So my parents were not in the party. It was really important what they talked about. The kids don't talk about it at school. So we understand, and it's interesting about the cultural differences. I think we Czechs, we understand privacy is very important because then the evil state cannot get back at you. So it's really important for us. Interesting also, we talk a lot about robotics. I must say it is a Czech word.
Of course
originally.
it is, robota,
That's
from Karel
right.
Čapek.
That's right. And since we talk about capitalism and democracy, so Joseph Schumpeter, who a lot of people know have coined the terms like innovation and entrepreneurship, was born in the territory of the Czech Republic. And he postulated something which I think needs to be said, and that's called creative destruction. It's a term that describes everything we talked about tonight. It's the two forces that are sort of going against each other: the force of progress and all the mess that it leaves around, what the trains did to the horse industry, and this is basically what we are dealing with, and we need to do it as humans. The robots won't deal with this for us, and so that's why we need to get together and deal with those tensions. And every single startup in our environment is dealing with those tensions. And I must reflect to the question back there. Reward and evil and good, and how is that related? And I'm pretty sure early stage Mark Zuckerberg was a good guy. He was like the founders I meet every day who want to make the world a better place. I think this is not happening at my end. The evil doesn't happen at my end of work. It happens much later on as the companies get much bigger and they are more responsible to other forces. I think, but as I mentioned before, we need to look at them early on so that they start right. So that I think that's an important thought.
Okay, we've got time for one more question.
Can I just throw just a very quick one in here
sure.
as well? Just something that was recently said about the New Zealand finance minister about the recent New Zealand budget, and he said that New Zealand is moving from just looking at economic well-being to an idea of national well-being, people well-being. So. It's interesting when you think about that in the policy world as well.
I think Bhutan has
The National Happiness
national
Index.
happiness.
Happiness.
Yep. So if you could introduce yourself, sir, please. Your question.
Hi, it's Alan from Synergy Group. So innovation and growth are always a recurring theme for universities, government, private sector, and incubators now. But I still feel that these organisation entities still work in silos. So I guess in a world where we talk about there are no borders, it's all about we're all in one system, what more can we do to really connect these entities together to really push growth and innovation in this space?
Probably I feel like I need to start again. So my next Friday board meeting will see all the vice chancellors and rectors of universities in Canberra run basically an incubator. So that's what we do here. We created a network of these big research and academic institutions, and this organization created the ecosystem with the government to support basically private sector startup growth. So that we were trying to bring them all together in the network. Is it easy? No, it's not, because a lot of these institutions are competing on the students' market. So they have to find ways how to work together. Do the professors understand the world of the businesses and the startups? Do the government understand it? They don't. So that's what's happening in situations like the Canberra Innovation Network. I encourage all of you to connect with us and to help us do that. I think it's an important thing. Bringing those three sectors, the parts of the triple helix together in a productive way can help jurisdictions and places like Canberra really speed up innovation and growth. So I think it's really important.
Yeah, the work that you're doing is absolutely incredible, bringing those groups together. And I think there's so much to be learned from each other. In the world that we're in with, what are future work models, we actually see just as much innovation coming out of, or probably more, coming out of smaller organisations and startups that are able to just operate in an agile way that aren't constrained by the structure and infrastructure that goes around large corporates. But equally, there are organisations or departments like the ATO who are doing some of the most innovative things when it comes to welcoming different portions of previously excluded talent into their workforce, and they're able to move on it really quickly. So we see ourselves as playing a bit of a role of sharing those best practices and saying, how can what one 17-person startup, how can we translate what they do into a really large, tens of thousands person organisation. So I think there's a lot to learn from each other, and I'd love to see more of it as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think I wouldn't undercall the other piece, right, which is that it's also not just about how do you make the literal connections, it's how do you value the connections in the first place. So it's what are the stories we tell about the work that don't say universities are good for this is good for that doesn't validate certain kinds of ways things are. And I wanted to not let you blow through a bit of, Czech pride there, Peter, because I think, for me, the story of the robot, tiny diversion here. The word robot was invented in a play by a Czechoslovakian playwright in 1921. He coined the term. He imagined a mechanical creature, and that word is a word we all still use. Nearly 100 years later, a word from art became a word of science, and I think part of why that happened was that it captured our imaginations. And I think there is a really important piece when you want to drive innovation, which isn't just about the practical work, but about the stories you tell. And the stories you tell about what success looks like and what the problems look like have to be ones that inspire people or provoke people. And I think we sometimes forget the virtue not just of the fact, but of the fiction.
Genevieve, Craig, Peter, Stephanie, thanks so much. Please put your hands together.
Yeah.